Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode. No. Okay. You'd think 40 episodes in, 40 some odd episodes in.
Doesn't get easier.
Be able to say hello to each other. I think it's because we've already done that. But hi, Sarah.
Hi, Stef.
Today we're talking about a concept that was suggested to us, I believe, but I know you've been holding on to a story about this one. So I kind of just want to jump right in talking about humility.
Mm-hmm.
The role of humility. What does it have to do with what we talk about?
You know, I love to get all existential.
Yeah.
Well, buckle up, people. So I also think at some point I'm probably going to talk about death when I'm talking about humility. So if people find those subjects triggering, I've got a friend of mine who's a therapist, and she goes into this existential crisis when she even thinks about the vastness of space and how big everything is and how small we are and how out of control that is. I think these subjects are important because I think even if we're not thinking about them consciously, they're there lurking at the back of our minds. Are we important? Are we not important? Do we matter? Don't we matter? And I think when it comes to the work I've done that's not been related to food, but has then had an impact on food, I think humility has been a really big one for me because it doesn't come naturally to me. I don't think I'm a naturally humble person. I see it as a practice. It is a practice for me. But we should probably talk about what we mean by humility.
Let's define it.
Yeah, well,
as we define it or as it is defined. Because I think talking about what does this have to do with it? And I even think we're going to have different stories about this. But okay, what's the definition of humility? I don't love this one. A modest or low view of one's own importance. Humbleness, essentially. But I liked this other one better, freedom from pride or arrogance.
And there's that famous, is it Eleanor Roosevelt quote? Do you know the one?
No.
Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less.
I like Eleanor.
She's a good egg, isn't she? And that one to me, I think makes the most sense. We only experience the world from our own perspective. So therefore we are the main protagonist in our lives. And I think it's very easy, certainly for me, to then put a great deal of importance on me and my experience, because that is the only way I can experience the world.
And fair enough, right? And in fact, we can use the protagonist role when we talk about, I use that to talk about body image. And that's how part of my healing process worked, is remembering that I'm the one living my life. And so prioritizing my experience of that is helpful instead of prioritizing other people's experience of my life and how I look and who I am.
And just prioritizing oneself in general is still something that I value. I think it's an important part of the work for a lot of people that I meet, is being able to prioritize yourself. But that, for me, it's not the action of whether you prioritize yourself or not. I actually had a therapist say to me that I struggled with humility.
Really?
Yeah. And I was really
you contain
stung.
Multitudes, Sarah.
Pardon?
You contain multitudes.
It's really painful. It was really painful to be told that by somebody who I'd probably been seeing for about 2 years and spilled everything out too. There was a piece of research that I came across where they took people who had a high level of dietary restraint. This is what they call it in the research. Basically, people who diet and stop dieting a lot. They move in and out of diets. And they gave them this self-focus evaluation questionnaire. And they found that these people, the way they viewed themselves was on par in terms of how self-centric they were with sociopaths.
I don't know. You know why? Because I also feel like the reason we diet and end up focusing on ourselves, how many times is it related to feeling a lack of being seen as a child, or in the family systems where one grew up? There has been a lack of validation and a minimization and emotional abandonment. so that I mean, maybe that is what it was related to sociopath. I mean, who knows? I mean, I don't know. It seems less about actual arrogance, as I would define it, as much as seeking something.
And the research sounds very provocative when it's presented like that. We're just looking at similar scores as in how self-focused somebody is. That doesn't mean being unkind. And actually, you can be very self-focused and still be putting everybody else first.
I know someone like that.
Yeah, it's not about this lack of caring that perhaps we might associate with a sociopath. But I know for me that when I was right into it, my world just narrowed and narrowed and narrowed.
Right.
This was the thing. This was the most important thing in my world. And so it was hard to feel connected or to take pleasure in other things. And it's that kind of intense self-focus that is going to mean someone scores highly on one of these kinds of questionnaires, even though there's still, of course, loads of differences between sociopaths and dieters.
Right. Well, I would assume that would be the case for anyone with any kind of addiction also.
Yeah, and I think that we're talking about pain, and I think pain it grabs our attention when we're hurting. So if we're in pain all the time and the pain is about ourselves and who we are, then of course that is where the focus is going to be. And actually, it wasn't safe for me, for that therapist at the time, to say what she did, because I don't think she was saying it to me as just an observation. I'd always felt this sense that she didn't like me. There was no warmth, there was no comfort or care from her. I found her very cold. So for me, it really felt like her exasperation that I was coming in and just talking about this, because there were so many things I cut myself off from doing. I didn't date for years because I thought there is no way I would ever consider dating whilst I'm stuck in an eating disorder. It didn't matter that I knew other people did. It was just, I don't know whether I was worried that if I took the focus off the eating disorder, that would mean I wouldn't recover. The irony being the complete opposite to what I would have needed at that time. I just didn't realize it.
Was that the straw that broke the camel's back for that therapeutic relationship? Just as an aside.
It really wasn't, because this was when I was in training and you have to be in therapy. And year one, I'd had this therapist that I had left after year one because I didn't feel like the therapeutic relationship was working, and I tried to talk to her about it. So I'd started with my second therapist in my training. And I just thought, interesting about doing it for other people. I was really concerned that what my motives would be for going, because I was like, if I just keep leaving therapists, does that say something about me?
Yeah.
So I didn't trust my evaluation of it.
Yeah.
That I wasn't just running away. In hindsight, having had much better therapists since, I can look at that and go, what I needed was to go. But at the time, I didn't trust myself to make that decision.
I also bounced therapist to therapist. Okay, so I guess an interesting question would be, not being inside of the diet cycle anymore, do you still consider yourself humble? Or do you consider yourself now more humble? Or as you say, it is still a practice. So how did that shift after the diet cycle stopped?
Because actually, I think there's an enormous amount of peace that comes with humility.
Yeah.
Because let's say I caught sight of my body and I didn't like what I saw, I could kind of go, okay, well, that's not the end of the world.
Right.
I could go somewhere and think, okay, people might think X, Y, Z about my body, but that's okay. That's not the end of the world. The world doesn't revolve around me. And for me, that was actually really liberating to start embracing that as a life philosophy.
That's my angle on this whole thing, just as a background. So when my eating disorder started, I was in high school and I lost a lot of weight and I got a lot of praise for that. And I was also, one of these type A, pretty classic case of an eating disorder. And so I rode that wave of validation and praise, and I got on my high horse, I think. I mean, not outwardly, but I think I felt like I was on the top of this mountain, and I had got lots of attention. I felt like I had it all together, and that became the bar that I needed to then maintain. Like that was my identity, really, especially at that age, right? So I went into college feeling like I had a lot to prove to carry over into this new phase of life with new people. Like I identified as someone who was admired. And when I went to college, as I've described here many times, everything fell apart. And I gained a lot of weight rapidly my freshman year. I was binging. I was no longer able to restrict. I then stopped going to classes. I made friends, but I was like, it was weird because I would just be in my dorm at a time when everyone else was really socializing and going out and meeting people and meeting guys. So I basically took everything that I had prided myself on socially, academically, and aesthetically. Everything fell. It was like the rug out was taken out from under me. And I have this theory now that I did that on purpose. Like that it was too much. It was too much to carry. It was too much to expect. And it was all of what my value was and my identity was. And I think that there was a part of me that wanted to say, like, who am I when I don't have these things, when I'm not that? And there was so much humility in my college years around realizing that I wasn't admired and that I wasn't the one that, guys wanted to ask out, and that I wasn't getting straight A's, and that I wasn't these things. I sometimes think about it now as what a foundation that gave me for later, because the rest of my life since, my identity hasn't depended on any of that, because I know how quickly that devolved and how empty it really was and how much I couldn't maintain that. I think there was such value in that humility, which was so hard at the time. At the time, that was like my worst nightmare. That is why I withdrew. I was like, I can't have people seeing me in this humble place. I just didn't feel safe there. But ultimately, I think that is so much of what freed me, which is why I really like that definition of it's freedom from arrogance. It's freedom from that place of the ego. And that's what that was for me, those years. That's what that did. That's what my college life was essentially about, was humility.
I can really feel that, because I think I relate on a few levels. I went from being the smallest one in my group to the biggest one in my group.
Yeah.
And I can remember one friend of mine particularly going out with all her friends, and they were so glamorous and so stunning. And I remember just that feeling of just like awkwardness, and even struggling to speak to these people when we weren't out in the clubs. I found it really shook me, and actually it made me think of that, the saying, pride comes before a fall.
Yeah.
There was a part of me that felt superior before, going from feeling superior to inferior, and then hopefully kind of landing somewhere in the middle. I felt like I just broke into pieces with the whole thing, and I didn't know who I was anymore. And there was this idea or this concept, I don't know if I heard it or if it came to me, that if you break yourself into pieces, there is an opportunity to put yourself back together a little differently.
Yeah.
And that, I think, really helped me. I think I became a more empathic person, and I think empathy and humility really come together as well as partners. I genuinely feel like everything I went through made me don't like to use the word better, but I'm a better person.
I think it allows you to keep your head on a little straight. I don't know if it feels like that. I mean, I think about it now in times where my ego is tempted to inflate at all. It's like, no, there's a check process. And I think without the experience of breaking apart or the humility, there might not be any reference point for having that check. It's so easy to get swept up in external validation, and having the experience of knowing what it's like to look that in the eye and say, I don't have that. Like, that isn't available. Can I see myself through that? How do I got to look somewhere else. And again, I like how you point out, it's not inferiority or superiority. I think it's just this, it reminds me of body image a lot. It's that neutrality. It's something about being able to separate oneself from one's ego in a way that's almost like a mindfulness about going back to the existential, like who we are, our place, like the smallness of this life.
I think it's Ram Dass who says that we're all just on the walk home together. Which home being, well, you don't have to go there quite so early in the show. But I was thinking though, for anybody listening to this, and this is just kind of how I imagine I would be feeling, I think I felt a great deal of shame at not being humble at the same time. So someone listening to this, maybe we sound a bit pious. Maybe we sound like, oh, we're doing this humility thing, and we used to be so superior and now we're just so good at not being superior.
How ironic.
I know. And I just really want to say I fought with this stuff and I struggled in this stuff for years. And for me, the first step to humility was letting go of trying to force something to be different, whether it was my body, whether it was life, whether it was time. I was reflecting the other day and something became a little bit clearer in my mind around when I was binging. A really big trigger for me was feeling disappointed. So I'd always said, okay, well, if I feel disappointed, I want to binge, but disappointment is more than just a feeling of disappointment. It's a rallying against things shouldn't be like this. Things were not the way I wanted them to be. So therefore, I might as well hit the self-destruct button, or I might as well just go unconscious and binge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, except I always wonder, like, why would one might as well because they're disappointed or because things didn't go as they wanted?
It's almost not being able to tolerate that.
Yeah.
I don't want to stay with that. Otherwise, I just have to feel it, and I didn't want to. And that for me is where the numbing comes in. And I think that's why just giving up restriction alone wasn't enough, because there was still this rallying against not wanting to stay as I was. So therefore wanting to escape as I was, even if I was eating enough food.
I don't know that I had as much of an issue with dealing with the intolerance of feelings, but when I went through recovery and gave up restriction, I gave myself this year to not restrict. And I went into it very much like I'm going to gain weight and that's going to happen. And I accept that going in, like in advance. There was a humility in that. There was like, I'm not needing to hold on to this body size anymore on purpose. So the tolerance piece was built in. It was kind of like, I don't need to run away from tolerating something because I'm doing it on purpose. And there's something about this idea of humility, like looking yourself in the eye and leaning into the parts of yourself that are intolerable. And Jesse Nealon talks about this as dark material, which I have the concept around this as like our shadow sides. But whatever your term, it's this idea that there's parts of us that carry more shame, or that we don't like, or we don't respect, that we aren't on board with being. And they're part of us. And the intolerance of being that or feeling that is often, I think, where the numbing out and the running away comes in. But I think through the process of saying, I'm going to have shadows coming at me left and right for a year, and like knowing that was a way of saying, I needed to outline it. I needed to say, like, this is going to have to be okay, because otherwise I would have been running from it. If I felt like I was doing it on purpose, then it felt more within my control. And I think maybe that's what it is like I almost set it up that I could tolerate that out of controlness about it by calling it that, by assuming that that was going to be the case. Because had I not done that, I think it would have been difficult for me to suddenly be confronted with my own self and my own humility and to stay there.
So what was in So what was in the shadows for you? What came out? If you want to say.
Yeah, I mean, so part of my whole thing was I compared myself to everyone in an inferior way. I always assumed I was less than, and that everyone was thinking X, Y, and Z of me, and I needed to prove myself through my body, and food. And that was the wall I hid behind. Like, if nothing else, I was good for telling people what, to eat and how to eat. And people came to me for that. That was how people knew me. I was the healthy one. It was saying, okay, well, when this is not there, how am I going to show up socially? And I'm an introvert. That was not okay with me. I thought I was supposed to be more boisterous and more outgoing and just want to socialize more. And so during this year, it was me coming a lot more face to face with my sensitivity, my intensity, my introversion, and my insecurities, and probably a lot of adjectives that I grew up with that I was running from for many, many years. And those resurfaced. I mean, those things came up because a lot of them were in part, they're authentic. Or a spin on them was authentic. And so it was like, okay. Flightiness was another one. As we were talking about, I moved from therapist to therapist. I moved from job to job. I was always interested in this thing and then this thing and then this thing. And that to me was, I was called flighty, but I always saw it as flaky. Like there was something about that that was inconsistent and unreliable. And all of those things started to surface. But I think what happened was I started to offer myself, rather than that inferiority complex, it was like, well, what if they just haven't been cultivated and directed in a productive way? Which is essentially how the latter part of my recovery ended up looking. It was me understanding myself, seeing it, saying, yeah, this feels like me. What is this? And redirecting it into a way that made sense in my life. So my introversion became coveted. Like that was kind of like, I need that recharge time. I'm not ashamed of it. I started to own it because I used to try to hide it from my kids, the times where I needed that alone time. And I would hide it from friends that were more extroverted. And I started to say like, oh, I can't, I'm already have plans this weekend. I can't go out twice, or me, I like, cause there were play dates I had and I would only be able to withstand like an hour and a half. And I was like, that was it. I needed to go home after that. It was too much. And I would start to say that. I would say like, me, my hour and a half is up. And that's just what I started to do. And it was like, okay, that's how I run. I started to look at my intensity differently. I started this Instagram account, I started to talk about the things that I felt intensely about and found people that resonated with it. So it became about, yes, sitting with these things that I'd never liked about myself and finding a way to maybe make them less inferior. We love connecting with our listeners, so we host regular community events on Zoom. We also have a private Facebook group for our Patreon supporters. Please visit our website, lifeafterdietspodcast.com, to find out more.
For more details about how to contact us or to work with Sarah or Stef individually, please check out the show notes. Now let's get back to the episode. So then perhaps humility is tied in with this idea of accepting parts of us that maybe we've been taught to believe, or we do believe we fall short at. It's kind of going, this is enough, right? Because maybe we're conditioned. Maybe part of me thinks like I have this idealized image of what I could be or should be. And the humility part is letting go of that. Because actually, if I was that would make me quite separate from other people. I don't think I could be the image that I have in my mind without becoming superior.
Good point. Great point, actually. Yeah, it's human.
Yeah.
It's the humanness, which time more and more, as we do this too, it's like listeners that write in and say, I love the parts where you don't know what you're doing. Like I like the parts where you guys flub, I think there is that feeling of, gosh, there's such relief in humanness and in realizing we're all human. And you're right. What a great point that if we were that version of ourselves that we imagine us to be, how superior and how alone that would make us.
Mm-hmm. I've also found that humility has allowed me to do things that I couldn't do before, because it's protected me from perfectionism and the resistance I had to making mistakes or being judged. Because I often think like the judgments that really sting are the things we're struggling with judging ourselves. But if we can accept that part of ourselves, when somebody throws a judgment at us, for me, when someone throws a judgment at me, if I kind of accepted that part of myself, it doesn't feel so bad. I can go, yeah, you're right. That's a part of my character that I have to manage. And that's fine. It's that it protects me from defensiveness as well.
Yes. An exercise that I was given once is identifying where these sources of humility are and like leaning farther into them. So like really embracing them. Like what would happen if you spent a week leaning into all of your insecurities and just being them unapologetically? So what happens as the world fell apart? I think we run. And what if we didn't? It's freedom to do that. And then there's some sort of level of, okay, this thing didn't kill me, or I can tolerate it. And then it sets you free.
Mm-hmm. Well, that, Stefanie Michele, is a beautiful segue into something I was going to share with you today. So, and all the listeners as well, because we've never spoken about this, but I think it was the first Clubhouse that you and I did together, the Clubhouse event. And for the listeners, we'd gone on, and I can't even remember what we titled it now, something about binge eating or food freedom. And we probably had about 50 or 60 people come along to that Clubhouse event. And people were just asking questions and we were responding. And we hadn't really used Clubhouse before. So I remember I was looking out for people who put their hands up and inviting them on stage and whatever. And then people would ask the question and I would respond. And then they would go, oh, yeah, okay, yeah. And then you would respond and they would go, oh, my goodness, yes, you're so right. And this happened several times. And I felt these like little pricks in my ego as I was listening to you. And I was going, oh, my goodness, Stefanie's amazing. She's doing this so much better than I am. And there was one person, I can't even remember what the question was. They'd asked a question and I'd answered the question. And you picked out, there was some subtext to the question. And you just really acknowledged where that person was. And they really responded to that. And I can remember in that moment, I felt shame. I felt shame because I remember thinking, gosh, like I'm the therapist. Do you know, this is the ego, right? I'm the therapist and I'm here missing this validation of people and really hearing what's going on. And it was the one we did where there was some conversations around exercise and exercise triggering binge eating. And I remember coming off that Clubhouse and just feeling really crappy about myself. And I remember sitting with this and it really felt like it's really interesting looking back on it now. Maybe I'm romanticizing the moment, but it really felt like this sort of fork in the road kind of moment, because what I wanted to do was actually withdraw and go, do you know what, this is too uncomfortable. And I just want to withdraw. And I remember picking up my phone because I thought to myself, what Stef was amazing. Like she was absolutely brilliant in that Clubhouse. And you need to tell her that, because that wouldn't have been my normal pattern. If I had not been willing to, like you say, lean into that feeling of insecurity. And I remember at the time it feeling like a really big thing to send you this message that was so true. This is what you think, you need to tell her. And I remember sending you that message. And I remember that kind of relief afterwards and just sitting with it and letting it go. It took a little bit and letting it go. And I suppose then you and I teaming up and doing this together, I have to think about this in terms of there is a message here that is so important, like right in my soul, that you and I share, and I want to get that out there by whatever means possible. And so in order to keep my ego in check, I sometimes think of it as and you could have the same experience. We could work with somebody who changes their relationship with food, and then they're the one that goes on and sets the world alight. Yeah. And we just had this little part to play. We were the catalyst. We don't get the glory. We don't get the recognition. And constantly coming back to that is what I mean by practice. I come back to that thing over and over again.
Wow, how vulnerable and humble of you, Sarah, to talk about that
here. I am very humble in my willingness to talk about it.
I mean, I don't know that this fits in the topic of humility, but it's just so interesting. It's very in real time here, folks, like that that ever happened is like it did, like that happened. And how many times I have felt that role reversal, you know what I mean? Like when I play back episodes to edit, I'm like, Stefanie, calm down. Like, stop talking so fast. Jeez. Everyone's here to listen to Sarah's slow, calm, regulated voice. Her wisdom. You know, like I feel like I'm like this. And then, you know, like anyway, it's just so interesting. Just perspective. Well, thank you for reaching out and telling me that day.
But if I hadn't, I don't think that you and I would have gone on to pair together and do what we're doing. Because my temptation was to be like, okay, I feel a bit inferior here, so I just want to step away from this. That was kind of the urge. But it was the sense, I suppose, of my value and purpose. And I remember saying this to myself at the same time, like, you can learn a lot from this person. Rather than thinking I should know it all. And that is a real vulnerable spot for me. And I have a friend, we kind of joke about it, because sometimes I just say things like I assume that they're facts, and she's like, are you sure? And she'll catch me out. And we laugh about it now. And I've really tried to just embrace that part of me that will do it. But sometimes if I don't know something, I just talk about it as if I do.
I mean, sometimes that carries a person.
Yeah, for sure. But when it's just you and a mate, you should be able to just go, I don't know.
Like,
I also think humility really offers this protective layer against being triggered. Does that make sense? Like,
well, yeah, it's sort of what you were saying. It
yeah,
takes
and
on that defense. Yeah.
yeah, but I'm thinking about with food now as well. When we have such high expectations of ourselves, and then we feel like we've fallen short of that, I think humility offers us a safe place to land.
I think it's tied up with what you said earlier about the perfectionism. I think all of this conversation is linked to that. Like there's this perfectionism, and when you take that away, there's space for humility, and then we don't fall from grace, or fall from expectation, including with food, where it's like the all or nothing. It's like I've failed, I've eaten the things, and now I might as well. I might as well just lean into that harder because it's a way of running from it, really. What about, though, someone who might be listening thinking, I live in humility. I feel humbled constantly, like the other end of the spectrum, rather than it being moving from that superiority or the ego into humility, but the other way, the inferiority.
Yeah, I would say that that's not humility and humbleness. So you're in that place of inferiority, of not good enough. And actually, humility can work the other way as well. It can make you feel better about yourself. There are people who will talk about, feelings of not good enough and inferiority as also the ego.
Yeah.
It becomes part of our identity, and it's a way that we separate ourselves. Well, I'm the worst binge eater in the world. I've definitely gone into that place. And I think with the humility, with being slightly less important, but like on a grander scale as opposed to less valuable, because there's a difference between being less important and less valuable. Like I like to think this idea that people are they're everything and they're nothing at the same time. This idea of paradox.
Yeah.
That we can be both. We can be on one hand so important, and on the other hand insignificant at the same time. And being able to hold that dichotomy for me is freeing. I don't know. I think some people might feel freaked out by that concept.
It feels like relief to allow yourselves to be both, because so often it's not one or the other. And I also like that you're pointing out inferiority is also a version of ego and can also be part of an identity. Thinking of it that way, I think, could be really helpful.
Unless people use it to beat themselves up and feel even worse
now they're like, now I'm inferior and egotistical. I also think it's human, like I think we have ego. I mean, this is how it's how we function in the world. There is an element of this that's really natural, and it's an evolution of it, but I think it's normal to a degree. I think it's just maybe about the awareness of it, reframing it for yourself.
Yeah, and it's like that idea that people will feel guilty about their pain because there are worse things going on in the world, that old line. And I think that the idea of there being people in worse situations than you are can be used to self-flagellate in an unhelpful way and invalidating your own feelings. I believe all feelings are valid. And on the other side, it can genuinely be used as a way to be humble and come back to a sense of appreciation, to be, okay, I'm not living in a war-torn country, and I'm just going to take a moment of appreciation for that. And maybe in half an hour time, I'm still going to feel awful about my body again. Like that being okay. It can be used. Right. It's how we use it.
I think it's and how we identify with it. Because I think there's a way of saying, like, there's other people that have it worse off. And saying that in and of itself, I think it's what you're saying, is a way of condemning oneself and shaming oneself about having thoughts or feelings. And that's what it's being used for, rather than as a perspective shift. And the other way around. It's like, how are we identifying with this comparison we're making? Are we using it as confirmation bias that we suck? Or are we using it to help ourselves and support ourselves and like gain some perspective that's neutral, not see, you should really be appreciating what you have. I think there's a total difference in them. And, even as I said that, I'm like, is that learned too? Because I think sometimes as kids, like, you should eat all your dinner because there's starving kid, that there's shame in that. Versus I observe that there's differences and there's privileges, and I can have perspective on that.
Do you think a little bit like the letting go of dieting, that there's an element of readiness about something like humility?
Yes, because there's a safety, as you say, like there's safety in not having that humility. So if it is protecting you from vulnerability that feels too unstable or unsafe, then you may need that shield in order to feel like you're not vulnerable to attack or criticism that may feel just too much to tolerate. So yes, and at some point, I think there's this slow movement towards, or there can be a movement towards feeling like maybe my identity can survive, or maybe I can emotionally regulate myself in the presence of vulnerability or criticism or abandonment if this thing pans true. If my imagined scenario comes to be where I am rejected because of where I'm not perfect.
Agreed. Next question. Do you think some people are naturally humble, or do you think that humility develops through challenges and pain and hardships?
I do think there's people who are natural. I don't know that you're born humble, but I think it can have a lot to do with the way you're raised. So I think that there's a there's a nurturing towards being able to stay humble that I think it's rare. But I think I know people who have really solid sense of self from the get-go, that lends itself to staying humble.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I'm now thinking of toddlers, and they are definitely not humble.
But, having kids, I think isn't that the work of toddlerhood? There's something about secure attachment, being securely attached and feeling like you are safe and loved. Just observing kids that I know, just like there's kids that move into a lot of entitlement or superiority almost. I feel like there's some level of how securely attached we are and how our sense of identity is getting formed in those years.
So we can really loop back round to let's blame the parents, eh?
No, because every parent is a product of their parents too. And I think it is such a cycle.
Yeah.
It is. I don't speak from experience or anything.
Of course not. Well, I think it's important in life to test ourselves. So if we could have a few more 5-star ratings, let's see if I can continue practicing humility.
Well, thanks, Sarah. Thanks everyone for listening. And if you can give us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts, it's much appreciated, and share with anyone who you think might benefit from hearing our podcast.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and stay humble.